are going to have a presentation and discussion around the Paris Permanent Citizens Assembly, and then we will adapt the agenda so that we keep the same lunch hour, so that we can start at the same time as scheduled for our speaker, who's connecting kindly at 7:30 a.m. his time, so that we can come back in time for that. So about the Paris Citizens Assembly, I don't have actually a whole series of slides and things. I just have an image of the model, which I'll pull up in a moment to explain a bit how it works. But I thought that before we go into that, it would be useful to give a little bit of the story and the context of how this came about, and I'll perhaps call on Yves at some points to come in and perhaps complement with some of the details. But one of the reasons why we presented the Belgian model earlier in detail, not only because it really came first, but also it was one of the main sources of inspiration for what has been happening in Paris, and especially when it comes to some of the design aspects of what came about. But the context is slightly different though, so I don't know if any of you had heard about the Gilets jaunes kind of protests in France that had been taking place, the Yellow Vest movements, which prompted something which was called the Grand Débat, the Great Debate, that took place all over France over the course of a few months. And so one of the things that happened during this time in the city of Paris was that there was one, what they called like citizens' convention, citizens' council, kind of like it was a deliberative process with a randomly selected group of people that they brought together about how people wanted to kind of improve and bring in citizen participation in the city of Paris. And one of the recommendations that came out of this citizens' council was to establish a permanent citizens' assembly that would work in the city of Paris. And so this is something that the mayor and the vice mayor for participation took really seriously. What they got these recommendations this was in the beginning of March, kind of around 2019. So then they had kind of started working on some of the reflections on this, and then COVID happened, which delayed a little bit about the priorities about this, and it kind of got put on hold for a bit. But then in the spring of 2021, they really picked up this dossier and wanted to start working on the design of this. And so the vice mayor for participation and her team, they started working on an initial design of what this permanent Paris Citizens Assembly could look like. And they wanted to make it actually incredibly ambitious and give it lots and lots of competencies and lots of different things. And then they got in touch with myself, with Yves, with a few other experts that we work with, and they wanted to get some feedback on this. And we didn't exactly completely tear apart what they came up with, but we were like, it's really great that you're ambitious, but we're not sure this is going to work. So then they kind of a bit more formally commissioned FIDE, and so Yves kind of coordinated this whole process, and I was involved with a few other people from FIDE to actually work together more concretely, trying to keep the ambition of what the Paris City Council really wanted to do, but thinking then a bit more based on all of our experience with deliberative democracy, how this could function, and how we could integrate it into the existing institutional architecture of the city of Paris. Because there's already quite a lot that happens in Paris when it comes to participation. So there's a super well-established participatory budget that has existed now for many years, has a really significant envelope of around 100 million euros. They have already existing bodies of, they have like a youth council, they have a young person's council, they have a council of Europeans living in Paris. So there's lots going on, and so we also wanted to really make sure that whatever we did wasn't just going to be this additional thing that got kind of added on as an extra thing in the landscape, that it really worked with and was connected to the existing system. So not just connected to the Paris City Council, but connected to these other institutions. So I'll bring up the slide for it to explain a little bit. Actually, maybe before, is there anything else, do you think, in terms of the context of how this came about that I missed? No, those are the main details. So how this Paris Citizens works, there was some inspiration that we drew from the Belgian model in terms of not just thinking about, okay, just one body and then thinking about its competencies, but thinking about what roles it might play and then how that might also necessitate having other more ad hoc citizens panels or assemblies that can be initiated by it. So the kind of core body is called the Citizens Assembly, and the people are selected by civic lottery, as in all of these. Anybody who is 16 years and over, not necessarily a French citizen, but anybody living in Paris is able to be eligible to be chosen to be part of this. And they have a 1-year mandate, although there's also written into the rules that that can potentially be extended by 6 months to make it 18 months in total. So this was also one of those things that was recommended to add a little bit of flexibility, given this was going to be the first time that this happened, and not knowing exactly how much time they might need to really be able to fulfill all their roles. There's going to be this option that once they come towards the near end of that term, whether they actually extend it or not. So it's still to be seen. Because actually, perhaps just to go back a bit before the model, just to give you a sense of the timings. So we had some initial meetings online by Zoom in June, July of last year, 2021. Then we had met in person in Paris for a few days to actually flesh out the details of this model in September. And then that was transformed from like a set of the written proposals from FIDE into a legal document, which is the internal regulation of the City Council, which was voted on and adopted in mid-October 2021. And so the first Citizens Assembly has now been convened since November, December 2021. So it all actually moved fairly quickly, and this is already in place and is running, but it's also the early days of it, so we don't have quite all the learnings in the same way we have about Belgium, but just to give you a sense of the timings and the context of it. So these 100 people have already been selected, and they've been working together, and because 100 people is quite a large number actually. If I think back to it, our initial recommendation was that that group would be smaller than 100, and it was actually the city councillors who wanted to increase the size of the group to 100 to show that this was something actually important and that they wanted to give some emphasis to. But one of the perhaps early learnings is that I think 50 would have been a better number for this group given their competencies, but we can also talk about this in the discussion. So because if you think back actually to the Belgian model, that more permanent body is smaller. It's only 24 people in that case. And so, yeah, there's a question about the right size given the competencies they have once we get into these more complex models where it's not just, okay, we have this policy issue, so we're going to convene the people, but we're thinking actually about the other roles they're playing. So what size, what length of time and stuff is appropriate. It's not necessarily the exact same considerations. So 100 people, 1-year mandate, and they work rather in working groups where they split up some of the main thematic areas to be able to make it a bit more manageable, that they're not all trying to work on everything, but there's three working groups that are a bit more focused on different parts of the things. And I'm struggling to think off the top of my head what they are, but one is, yeah. Yeah, I think it works. Okay.
Social affairs and education, environnement et espace public.
Environment. Yeah, okay, yeah, environment.
Environment and climate. So
yeah, climate and environment, and then like the public space. And so most of their meetings actually take place in the smaller working groups, but they're convened in the plenary with everyone at least twice a year. So Yves and I have both been to the plenary sessions that they've had so far to observe. And this group of the Citizens Assembly has a few different competencies. So I mentioned earlier that Paris has a really well-established participatory budgeting program. Like every Parisian knows about it. It's quite an important thing. So to connect it to this, also because in like the participatory budgeting, because it's been in place for a long time, how it works has also evolved. So now every year there's actually a kind of overarching theme to all the proposals that can be put forth for the participatory budget. And And so from now on, instead of the city council choosing this theme, it's the citizens' assembly that chooses what is the theme. So it's quite an important competency to be able to influence what a good proportion of like investment decisions are going to be spent on and prioritized in this moment in time. Next, if I jump up to the top there, they have the same ability as the elected councillors to be able to put forth what are called current events questions or current affairs questions and vœux, so like wishes. I don't know if there's something similar here. So it doesn't actually have a legal basis, but it gives the way for it to have a formal way of asking in this public space where there's a written record and to demand some answers around current affairs, things that are happening from the elected councillors. So they're also able to put those forth. They're able to initiate what's called an evaluation mission, so of an existing public policy that's in place in Paris. They have the means now to be able to request that this is evaluated so that they're able to have some more information and better understanding of how this is really working and the impact of it. And then they have an agenda setting role. So they're also able to choose the topic for a one-off citizens jury, which here it's a smaller group of people that are given more time and resources to explore in depth one policy issue. So this is like a classic citizens jury that we've been talking about for all of these months. And the way it works is that citizens jury, the form of their recommendations is actually in the form of a local bill. And again, this has to do with like the legal context that it can't go directly from the citizens jury to the council, so the legal bill gets put forth to the citizens assembly that is also able to actually look it over, deliberate it, and the citizens assembly officially puts it forth via the vice mayor back to the Paris City Council, where they have to have a debate on it and they have to vote on it. So again, because this is all in the legal text, there's also the requirement for the written response to the citizens jury's local bill, but also these other things that they're able to have competence in, where there's a requirement that there's actually action that happens off of the basis of this. And like in Belgium and the other examples, there's also a secretariat, so there's the administrative support to support this and to make this possible. And then there's also an oversight committee. So at the moment, Yves and I are part of this, as well as two other French deliberation experts, and so that's why we've been going to the plenaries and we receive the information about what kind of work they've been doing in the working groups. And yeah, so I think it's still like in a bit of an earlier stage of things. So there's perhaps less to be saying at this point in terms of some of the learnings. I mean, we've had some observations, I think, about how they're doing things versus how our initial plan or proposal was versus how it might be adapted in the future. So I mean, for us, this is one of those things where it's also, like I said yesterday, all these examples are really most of them from the past 3, 4, 5 years. So it's still in a phase of experimentation in the sense that it's really important that we're evaluating how this is working and leaving a bit of room to be able to adapt and to change over time. Yesterday I had shared one of the examples, for example, in the Brussels region where they have the mixed deliberative committees where there's the 15 MPs with the 45 randomly selected citizens, and they've had 5 iterations of them. After each one, they've slightly adapted actually how it works based on some of the learnings they've had from that last iteration. And I think with any approach to institutionalization right now, there also has to be a bit of that spirit of like, we have a lot of knowledge and understanding of generally what works within a deliberative body. So in terms of within one of these, like needing to have enough time, the skilled facilitation, access to expertise, and so on. But when we're moving into a more complex approach of thinking of how these things function together, there's also a need to still, I think, be open to adapting this and learning from it and not taking this also like in stone either. So I think that's also one of the things that we're wanting to get across through this workshop too. So yeah, Yves, did you want to add anything to the explanation to this?
example, this setting 100 citizens, they were like, oh, but they didn't think through that this has a lot of consequences on facilitation. So what we have seen in the plenary is they didn't foresee enough facilitation because the plan was something smaller, but now they have 100 citizens and you have actually very big groups without facilitators, and they're realizing, that's not, so they could have decided to take 100, but it would have been good at that point. So just as kind of, none of these things have to be set in stone. You can be flexible with the different models you will hear, but do touch base, and it doesn't have to be me but with the people from the labs and Arancha, to make sure, like, hey, we're thinking of maybe doing this, because what we do know is that every step might have some consequences, or what is the carrying capacity of citizens, or how much you can do, or this will imply extra facilitation. Budget means just going for 100. I actually had the same experience where we were in time with a village of 5,000 inhabitants. And they also had, we'll do 100 citizens. And we had a preliminary expert meeting. And I'm like, I told the budget and the facilitation, I'm like, 40 will do. And they ended up with 40. So sometimes just touching base is not a bad thing. So for every step you take.
So I don't know if you have any questions about this model in particular.
Maybe I wanted to know a little bit more how the political representatives were, like, to what extent they were involved in this, or how they reacted, and what was the process of getting everyone on board. And I think that's interesting.
We did the same thing as in East Belgium, is that I talked to every political fraction that wanted to talk to me. And this included actually, and there's a lot of them in Paris actually, there's like different types of communists and stuff like that. I discovered that you have a lot of political factions. So I talked to everybody who, I think part of the COVID thing in this was that these were Zoom calls. Whereas in West Belgium, we went to see the people face to face and really in their village. I remember I at some point took a picture for David Farejo, who is the writer, where I was on my way to meet one of the ministers, and I had to park my car in the mud because a tractor was coming and I was like, wow, expert deliberative, like you're the big consultant. I'm like in the mud somewhere behind the tractor. But we went to see people personally, and here it was, I talked to somebody from the opposition through a Zoom, the vice mayor then introduced me first. It felt very, like here, we talk in person. I think I heard you say several times you've had a lot of Zoom meetings and how good it is to meet each other in person. So that was really lacking, and so the opposition is not on board with this. They're not, for the moment, as far as I know, openly carrying opposition against this. So I think they're a bit in a wait-and-see situation, but it's less than optimal. The problem with politicizing this, or if it becomes the ownership of a political fraction or one majority, is that also it's succeeding is maybe sometimes seen. And I don't want to, this is a small town, but in big, where politics is really a game of, where this might be seen as, this is a project from the current majority, and assume this becomes successful and wow, then maybe the oppositions might even have an incentive to attack it just regardless of, because it is otherwise too much a victory for, and that's what we always want to avoid. And so for me, that's a fragility in this case, is that we didn't manage, and I think part of it is also. And actually the 100 was actually even a consensus within the majority. Just between, this is taped, so I was thinking, how much can I say? No, it's fine. But it was actually one of the parties that was in the majority, but was not in the preliminary talks, who asked this as a condition to be on board. It was really something almost adored, or we don't vote. And so it was 100. And so, but not being there was it really felt like from this, you could see this happen, but we couldn't.
Well, there was a good intention behind it, because in the sense they wanted it to be bigger, to show that this is something that is actually important, that they support and so on, but there was not that, I think, sense of awareness or understanding of all the implications of that.
And I think one of the things is in the oversight committee, there is place, we have agreed that normally there's a representative of every political party. At the moment, because we're still doing a lot of design, it's again very open, we're really using those oversight committees to now try to, meeting by meeting, to adapt and correct a bit of the things that now are happening with this bigger and working groups that weren't foreseen. So it's really, they actually created a new model of their own. A model we didn't have the model, it's like, okay, how can we now make this work? So, but the idea is to bring in those political representatives in the oversight committee, because the best disinfecting the sunlight, as a judge, an American judge once said. Being transparent and public, if you take the opposition in, even if they weren't a part of it, but you show everything. And the oversight committees where they can also put forward claims that something isn't going well, or that, oh look, the experts were only chosen to represent your view or whatever. And so you give them a seat there. And if there is something, please make your claim, but you have to do it in a,
but it is something that is strongly supported, at least by the mayor and vice mayor. So the last plenary meeting we were at in May, there was the mayor Hidalgo who came, who spoke with the citizens, but also was listening to what each of these working groups had come up with. They had some questions as well that they wanted answers for. So it was quite something to see, like, the mayor and the vice mayor then having some of the citizens from the working groups beside her. One was like a 17-year-old, the other one, she was like 80, I think, and they were the kind of two that had volunteered from their working group to come and report back. So you really see how these are not the usual people who are involved in politics in any way, and so we had a chance to speak to some of the citizens as well a little bit more informally after the plenary, and they were like, yeah, I mean, I got the invitation and was just kind of curious, and I thought, yeah, it would be important to do this. And so it has been nice to see that aspect of things which comes through, regardless of like the details of the model. I think will need to change, but it's still already having some positive impact, at least from that perspective of citizens feeling like, okay, we're getting to actually meet the mayor, have an important role here, meeting a really like much more diverse group of people that they're probably in interaction with in any